Hey everybody, and welcome back to the next video on how to start a podcast. In this episode, we're going to cover three big topics. We're going to talk about podcast artwork and how to create it, how to write a description and show notes for your podcast, and picking the right podcast category. All right, the first thing we're going to cover is podcast artwork. While excellent podcast content should always be the focus of your podcast cover art is the first thing your listeners will see when they're looking at Apple Podcasts or on social media. You want people to look at your artwork and at a glance know what your podcast is about. All these specs are going to be based off of Apple Podcasts. They were the pioneer. They made the first podcast directory, at least the first one that got really big. And if you follow their guidelines, your podcast is going to be set up to work well everywhere. Apple has specific guidelines that they want you to follow to get into Apple Podcasts. The first is that your artwork needs to be a square. So there you go. And we recommend it be exactly 3,000 by 3,000 pixels. Technically, it can be smaller than that, but Apple wants to be 3,000 by 3,000 if they pick you for Apple New and Noteworthy. So it's best to just design for that size. Let's assume you're gonna get into New and Noteworthy. Your file type should be a PNG or a JPEG. Personally, we recommend going with a PNG since they typically have better detail and they're better at resizing. And we're gonna do a lot of resizing with your artwork. All right, so your artwork does need to be original and it can't contain any of these things that you probably don't want anyway. So blurry, misaligned, mismatched, pixelated images, those are out. Explicit language, that's out. Placeholder images. So we don't want to have one piece of artwork for a ton of podcasts. And any Apple stuff. So don't use any Apple images, logos, names, trademarks, hardware, anything that really Apple just doesn't want it to look like they're endorsing your show. And then don't include any references to drugs, illegal drugs, profanity, or violence. So that's what you need to get into Apple Podcasts. If your artwork doesn't meet these guidelines, it might get rejected. All right, so now that we've tackled all the technical specs, got those out of the way, let's talk about some helpful tips that'll help your podcast stand out. First is, your artwork should visually communicate the subject of your podcast. The goal here is to make sure potential listeners understand what your podcast is about before they even listen, and you want to make a great first impression. So if you're launching a podcast for your hobby, you're going to want to make sure you use artwork specific to your hobby. Example of that would be Star Wars. If you're doing a Star Wars podcast, put some Star Wars type imagery in the artwork. If you're launching a podcast for a business or a church or something that has an existing brand, follow your existing brand guidelines. Make sure that people can look at it and see, oh, I know who is putting out this podcast. Second tip is design for a variety of sizes. So as I alluded to earlier with the PNG file type, you're designing your podcast artwork so that it looks great at a variety of sizes because it's going to be displayed on large monitors and also down to really small versions on just an iPhone. So make sure it's simple enough that if it was 55 by 55 pixels, you can still see what the artwork is depicting. Part of that is the next tip, which is don't use too many words in your podcast. Your artwork is really going to have to work in a lot of different sizes. So it's a different challenge. And part of that is making sure you don't use a lot of words because once you have more than 3 or 4 words, it's going to be hard to read anything when it gets down to the smaller sizes. So minimize the number of words, maybe 3 or 4 is a good metric. Then the next tip is avoid microphones, headsets, and other overused podcasting images. Podcast artwork is just full of all these images where people have like a microphone and a horse because their podcast is about horses. This misses the whole point of the podcast. Podcasting is the medium. It's what you're using to convey your ideas. It is not the subject of your podcast. Think about movies. Movie covers don't have pictures of DVDs and TV sets. They use that artwork space to represent what the movie is about. exploding buildings and car chases. The only exception is something like our podcast, How to Start a Podcast. The subject of that one is podcasting, so we have images of microphones. The next one is be consistent. Your podcast artwork is part of your overall podcast branding. So you want to use consistent imagery across all your brands. Think like Apple, Coca-Cola, Nike. They're all masters at branding, and part of that is using consistent imagery across all of the platforms. When you're designing your artwork, try to use the same logo and images that you'd use on your website. Use that also on Twitter, Facebook, other platforms, and your podcast artwork. That way, your listeners and followers can recognize your brand by just seeing your images. Next tip, do a quick spot check of your competition. If you're launching a podcast in, let's say, the business section of Apple Podcasts, you want to make sure it's going to stand out when it gets there. So take a look at that section and see if everyone's doing the same thing. If you see a lot of monochromatic, all black and white images, maybe make one that has some color to stand out. Take a look and see if there's anything you could do that would be special. All right, now that we've got the technical and design stuff out of the way, how do you actually make the podcast artwork? If you have a design background, you already know what to do. You've probably got Photoshop or Sketch installed on your computer. But for the rest of us, I would recommend either using Canva or 99 Designs. 99 Designs is great if you're able to spend a few $100s. It allows you to get a professional level design for your podcast artwork. You can go one of two ways. You can either run a design contest where designers compete to create the best design over a series of rounds and you pick the best one, or you can work directly with a designer whose work you love to create something unique for your show. It's actually what we use to create the artwork for How to Start a Podcast. If you're going to design the artwork yourself, I would recommend using Canva. Canva is a simple web-based image editor, and it's pretty easy to use. You can also check out a website called Pexels. Not Pixels, it's Pexels with a P-E-X-E-L-S. Pexels has tons of beautiful images that are totally free to use. And they've got thousands, so you can just go search for some images that are related to your podcast, and you can find a beautiful image that you like. Then you can use that, load it into Canva, add the title of your podcast, and you're half of the way there. So go ahead and experiment with that and see if you can create something that you really love. Just make sure that the images are large enough that they fit at 3,000 by 3,000 pixels. All right, so once we've finished your podcast artwork, we need to write some descriptions. The first is the description for your podcast as a whole. Think of this like the description on the channel for a YouTube channel. This is where you're going to describe your entire podcast in about a paragraph. If you're on Buzzsprout, you can find this by going to the podcast settings tab, and there'll be a space for a podcast description. So what you're going to do here is you're going to try to tell people in just a couple of sentences what your podcast is about and what's in it for them if they listen to it. Try to make this a little bit entertaining so people get a feel for what the show's going to be about, and hopefully they're incentivized to subscribe. We can always change this stuff later, so don't let finding the perfect description hold you back from publishing. The second spot is your episode description. This is sometimes called show notes. Your show notes are where you give people a short description of a particular episode, maybe a couple details of things that you wanted to share. This can include things like links to products you talked about, your Apple Podcast page if you want people to leave reviews, Patreon page for somebody to give you a small donation. You'll write this and put it in when you upload a new episode to Buzzsprout. And on average, I'd recommend 2 to 3 sentences along with a couple bullet points. One reason why this is so valuable is because Google is starting to search podcasts and include them in Google search results. So it's possible with a good description that Google will see your podcast and will actually show it to people who are searching. And it's a great way for new people to find your podcast. All right, the last thing we're going to do in this video is pick a category for your podcast. Now, it's important to get this right because categories are how Apple organizes all the shows in the directories. And they actually have separate charts for each category and subcategory. So you want to make sure that you pick the right category so that your podcast, let's say you've got like a gardening podcast, you don't want that to be mixed in with all of the politics podcasts, for instance. Now, you can pick 3 categories, and you'd pick these in Buzzsprout by going to podcast settings and then scrolling down. You can pick 3, but Apple Podcasts only cares about your first category. So make sure that your first category is your primary category. Other apps will use the other 2, so select good ones for there as well, but that first one really matters. You can see all these options inside of Buzzsprout, and we'll also link to a blog post where we list out all of the categories so you can see which one is best for you. It's also a good idea to pick a subcategory as well. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. Let's say you have a politics show. Well, it's better for you to be near the top of the news subcategory politics rather than being further down in the general news category. Most people won't find you if you're not in your specific category, and they're definitely not going to keep scrolling once they've seen 3 or 4 good shows. So it's better to be at the top of a particular subcategory than just mixed in with a bunch of other podcasts. All right, so we talked about a lot in this video. We covered podcast artwork and what you need to know and how to create it. You wrote your description for your podcast and show notes. And then we picked podcast categories. Picked 3, but we know number 1 is the most important. If you have a Buzzsprout account, go ahead and upload your artwork, save your podcast description, and pick which categories you're going to be in. In the next video, we're going to be talking about podcast directories, so we need all that stuff to be saved before we can start submitting. I'm going to be walking you through the whole process of getting into the 3 most important directories. That's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. And this next video is going to be a breeze, honestly, compared to some of the ones we've done in the past. So I'm pretty excited to get to do it with you. So once you've got everything saved, head to the next video and we'll see you there.